Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you our third and final read of The Membranes by Chi Ta-wei. In this read, we wrap everything up, but we also start to look at the characters as a whole. I think the author does a good job of giving us everything we need as we come towards the end of this book. But one of the things that we see is maybe a little bit of deception by the mother in this book.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also not unfamiliar to what I think our life experiences may be. If you grew up in a place where Santa Claus was something that was spread around, or elf on a shelf, like these are all not necessarily terrible lies, but they're all misleading type of things that your parents tell you.
Mm-hmm.
They even tell you things like, I mean, who knows if they believe it, but don't go outside when your hair's wet or else you'll catch a cold. Don't leave the fan on when you're sleeping or else you'll die. We hear a lot of things from our parents, and whether it's to lower the bill for electricity or if they actually believe it but still perpetuate these misconceptions, kind of brings up the thought of, if our parents know that what they're saying isn't true, is it okay for them to fib or maybe not tell the whole truth?
Well, I think it depends. It's one thing to tell a child about fantastical things so that they can have an imagination, but it's another thing to be deceiving in what's really going on in the household, for example.
But those fantastical things can also turn into maybe not so great things in the future. Like, one of the things we learn are stories from the Bible, and some of the stories are more fantastical than another. The story of Noah's Ark, Daniel and the Lion's Den, Jonah and the Whale, like, all of these they seemed a little bit more like fairy tales for kids
Mm-hmm.
than it did seem. I feel like I'll get an argument by people who are more deeply religious, but it didn't seem like something that was being passed on as religious sacred text, but much more along the lines of, here are stories so that we can get you interested in what we're trying to get you interested in.
For sure. When it comes to sharing magical or imaginative stories, I think it's one thing to make believe like it's true. It's another thing to share those stories, have them build this world in their minds, and then tell them that it's not truly real. Because that's kind of what my mom did. She kind of shot down all the things that were untrue, like Santa Claus, like the Tooth Fairy. She would be like, no, those aren't real things, but it's okay to make believe.
Mm-hmm. And there are the more real to life examples of what we talked when we first went into this book. And it's the thought of having your child go to the doctor's office or go to the dentist, and maybe you tell them that you're going to go get ice cream or something like that, and kind of lead them that way, which I think that's more on the deceptive side.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the sense of protecting your child, helping feed them vegetables, or giving them good things through maybe the means that aren't 100% necessarily straightforward.
Mm. So are you on the side of deception?
I think for the most part, if the deception's from a good place and it's not something that will truly ruin the child's life or put them down a path where their brains are in a place where they can't recover from, I guess,
Mm.
then I think light deception is probably okay.
Mm.
But then if you're having them join a cult and telling them that, I don't know, something, which I guess in that way, I don't know, what if the cult is good and they're living happy lives? Then is it really that bad?
Are there any good cults?
I mean, it matters what you define a cult as.
Hmm.
Anyways, I think the morality is based off of the person, the individual, the family, whoever is in that situation. The answer is always going to be different based off of the situation. So I don't know if we'll be able to figure out the moral cause of lying to your child or not.
Right. And it's also coming from a space where we don't have children, so take that with a grain of salt.
Yep. And if you do have salt lying around, something that you can put it in is maybe some ceramics. And the person we're going to be talking about for the recommendation for the week might be able to help you. So let's go into our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is AJE Pottery. Amy Jan Ernst of AJE Pottery is a ceramicist who creates dumplings, toast, and other cute shapes for daily use, such as bowls, mugs, plates, and trinket dishes. Their hope is to bring joy through their creations. And I got myself my own little dumpling from their Valentine collection, and it's so cute. It's part of my collection on my desk, and it brings me so much joy. You can learn more about AJE Pottery on their website at ajepottery.com and on Instagram at AJE Pottery.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so read 3 of The Membranes by Chitawe. We have just read pages 115 through 152, which included chapters 10 through 13, and the promiscuous literacy at the end.
Yes, and a quick recap of what we know so far is that we find out that Momo has been a voyeur through her scanner, that she's part android, and that she snooped in her mother's notebook.
Yeah, and we continued to learn the life of Momo because the last place that we left off in our read is that she was looking through the laptop of her estranged mother, who she hadn't seen in over 10, 15, I think coming on to 20 years.
20 years.
And the things she found in the laptop were moments from her life, but we couldn't quite put it together of why those moments were there or what that all meant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we kind of pick up on this read.
Right. We see a change in point of view here. We've been looking through Momo's eyes for the longest time, but in this third read, we start to look from the point of view of the mother as well as an omniscient point of view.
Yeah, and that omniscient point of view gives us all the details of what's been going on with Momo's life.
Mm-hmm.
The explanation for why there are all these disk drives and these memories that were stored on her mother's computer wasn't because her mother was spying on her, but it was because her mother was creating these false memories to try to make sure that Momo was as much of a human as possible.
Right. And the reason why she had to do that was because during the surgery that Momo went through, the surgeons found that the logo virus that her body underwent had infected all of her organs except for her brain.
Yeah, and this is a major spoiler alert, so if you were planning to read this book, I would probably stop listening now.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even go back and forget some of the stuff we told you. But yeah, so her body was completely infected, which meant no organs could be saved, which was a very unique situation at the time. But what we learned is that Draupadi was not just a customer or a person that was coming in and out of Momo's life, but she was a representative for ISM, which was this newer company that was advancing M-bots. What Draupadi gave as an opportunity to Momo's mother was to have Momo completely transfer into an M-bot body, but being able to keep the brain. And along with that deal, her mother had to sign a 20-year lease to allow ISM to control Momo's brain and control her ability to work on different projects that the ISM wanted.
Exactly. So this shows us that Momo's reality versus her perception were completely different. In her perception, she thought she was a dermal care technician, but in reality, she was this android fixing up M-bots.
Yeah. And apparently she wasn't underwater in the bubble. She was actually on the main Earth.
Mm-hmm.
The way the book explains it, and I'm using a quote from the book, is that they detail how Momo's memories were formed.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and this is the quote, "The first were the fake diaries that mother sent her. The second were thoughts implanted by ISM. And the third were the memories remaining from before Momo's surgery. These 3 forces together formed the world as Momo knew it."
Mm.
What did you think? Because, I mean, one is her mom didn't have a choice. Her mother was either going to lose Momo to the logo virus, or she had to agree with this new unperformed surgery that no one had ever tried before. Like, Momo was the prototype to this.
Right.
But her mother also had to agree to not contact Momo for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
What did you feel about this whole predicament that, I guess, from the perspective of the mother?
It's so hard to say, again, coming from a place of childlessness. But this predicament definitely is a catch-22 in that either her mother loses Momo forever or she loses Momo for 20 years. And I think what she does with Momo's memory and using the discazines is kind of a way for her to make up for this lease.
Yeah, it's also the fact that there was no other option. So her mother was just trying her best to be a mother without being available.
Mm,
And I think we may not ever know what that feels like,
right.
but we still know what it feels like to be human and to take care of someone else. And although that connection may not be the same, the amount of sacrifice that I think Momo's mother had to make so that she can keep Momo to some extent must have been just dramatic. It must have been harrowing on her to, I don't know, go 20 years with the fact that your daughter is not going to be available to you, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering why Momo's mother didn't just write herself into the disc scenes so that Momo didn't feel so lonely.
I don't think Momo's mother could have just appeared. I think everyone that appeared to her were people that were actually there. Like Tomi Ito was a person that I think was actually there. When we saw Drapati and she dropped off like the M skins, that must have actually been her. When we saw Tomi Ito, like I think that was Tomi Ito's actual presence. I don't think that was a falsified version of the person.
Hmm.
And with the contract that her mother had signed, that is what I think created the necessary distance between her mother and Momo.
Hmm. Which I think would kind of hurt her in the long run, especially when she does reclaim Momo's brain.
But we do catch a glimpse at the end of them both being happy. We see
Hmm.
them re meeting on the bridge, and I think there's at least a point of understanding. And it didn't seem like Momo was unwilling to forgive her mother. I think what Momo needed was answers. So
Hmm.
even though maybe Momo didn't want to meet her mother all the way up to this final scene when they finally were able to meet after the contract had ended, I do think that Momo had an opening or a soft spot for her mother because I just think that that love and that care doesn't go away.
Hmm. That's fair.
Another major point of this book, though, was the transparency and the clairvoyance of LGBT plus themes.
Mm-hmm.
We had talked about what our guesses were on what was going on in this book, especially during the first part. In our last read, we talked about what did we think was actually going on with Momo and what her body was and all that stuff.
Right.
And one of the things that we had disagreed on that we weren't quite sure on was we talked about Momo as a child having a PP, as they say, and now not having that body part,
Right.
which would still make sense with the android, but what we get more clarity on is the creation and the inception of Momo. And the fact that Momo's mother was expecting to have a female. And
Mm-hmm.
after she found out that she had a male and realizing that there was going to be this necessary surgery to get an android, that's when Momo's mother decided to have Momo become a female,
At least in body form.
at least in body form.
Mm-hmm.
The part that I wasn't sure about is did Momo ever have a choice? Like you asked in a previous episode whether Momo had consent on the surgery.
Yeah.
My question now is did Momo want or have consent on what gender or what this person felt like?
Hmm. I think when it comes to gender, people know already. Like, regardless of how they were brought up, people know.
I agree, but we never get the perception of what Momo felt.
Fair. We only get so far with Momo's consciousness. What I think, though, is Momo was very clear that she didn't like that body part and she saw herself as a girl for the most part.
I think where I read, I just didn't see as much of that. And I mainly saw what the mother and I guess Tomi Ito, who was the mother's person to have Momo with,
Mm-hmm.
I saw more of their desires coming through to change Momo rather than Momo's desire to change herself.
That's fair.
So I think this is more of just how you read the book and what perceptions someone might get from it.
Yeah, definitely. It's based on personal interpretation.
Hmm. What I would say though is that during the promiscuous literacy, which was tagged on by the very end by the translator, there is a really good thought that they create in terms of the inclusion of LGBT plus material within this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I did want to read that quote.
For sure.
It says, the membranes presents as quite unremarkable that Momo has two mommies. Mommies who commission Momo as a test tube baby and later break up. In a kind of tribute to feminist utopias, Chi eliminates most male characters from the membranes so that the only adult person with a penis we see in the book, a caricature of a gay profligate, a figure who smacks of self-satire, is only referred to indirectly by the sympathetic cyborg whose organs will soon be harvested in his master's service.
Mm-hmm.
I think this gave us a direction of what the author wanted and maybe a little bit of clarity into, I guess it's not just LGBT plus material, but maybe the evolution past a patriarchal society.
Right, exactly. It also showed how the world, or at least the world in this book, was no longer focusing on productivity or reproductivity.
Right. It moved beyond that and it used the efforts of technology and other means to show that it is a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So this was most of the book, but I do want to come back to one thing, and I do think that this was a Chekhov's gun. I do think this was a major theme of the story that we saw previously in our first read, but got much more clarity as we finish up the rest of the book.
Mm.
What I want to talk about is the line that was used as Momo was spending her last days with her friend Andy in the hospital.
Mm.
Andy leaned over, they touched foreheads, and what Andy whispered was, "You are a canary in a cage." This was in reference to the soldiers who would use canaries as a way of testing for poison while you leave them in a cage.
Mm-hmm.
So they were utilized to check for safe scenarios. I would say I didn't find this connection until I went back and I was editing our first episode.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find the connection to this and the theme of the book?
Eventually, yes, but it was all the way until the end before I figured it out. Otherwise, I was thinking it was more of a metaphor rather than a literal canary in a cage.
Well, I think there's the literal part. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's the fact that Momo is trapped within the body.
Yes.
But then when we look at what those canaries were used for, which was to test, to be a prototype in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
then we think about what those canaries were used for, which was to test the safety, which was to go forth first so that others were safer.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we see Momo and the ISM company come together, where Momo was a prototype for using these cyborgs and these M-bots for the human bodies. And when we see the contract end, we see Drapati even talk about the fact that they don't need Momo anymore because they have so many M-bots that are now available and far beyond the capabilities of what Momo had, but they needed Momo as the initial prototype to make sure that this happened.
Right, that it was safe, quote unquote.
Yeah, so absolutely. She was a canary in a cage in the sense that her body was stuck within this cyborg. And I mean, she didn't have any memories besides what her mother gave her. She was just there and present and fluttering.
Mm-hmm.
But then we also get the sense that her body was used, her brain was used as a form of trying to advance technology. And from everything that we can understand, ISM does not sound like a great company.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so her body was used for the product of financial gains, most likely.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the book also mentions it that ISM is part of all the bad things in the world: capitalism, sexism,
Mm-hmm.
and
All
so
the
forth. All
isms.
the isms.
That's why they were called ISM, was ism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a profound book. So let's go into what we thought about it, because I would say two-thirds into the book, I wasn't massively interested. I was going along with it. I was curious kind of what was happening, but I think if this book wasn't recommended to me, I don't know if I finished it.
Interesting. I feel different. I felt as though I was clawing my way through and trying to figure out what was happening all the time until the very end. where it was a payoff of what exactly it was that we were looking for.
Yeah, I think I would agree on the payoff. That ending was so well knit together,
Mm-hmm.
and for a book that left so much to the imagination of what that world looks like, they also didn't overexpand on the fantastic. They didn't
Right.
create too many situations that seemed unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And so overall, it felt true to life. It felt raw. You sensed the emotions of the characters, even though you only kind of got glimpses into them through a single person narrative for the most part.
Right.
And then, yeah, the omniscient point that comes at the end where we see why everything has happened the way that it did really helped wrap up the story.
Exactly. And on top of that, what's so interesting about the book is the morality piece. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is it right that her mother did what she did? Is it right that Ism did what they did?
Mm-hmm.
Is it right to have Momo be pretty much a puppet for each of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these are all things that I think as we continue to evolve as a society, as AI gets larger, as robotics gets bigger, and we're seeing all of this stuff happen, we are going to eventually have to face these moralities of what does robotics really mean? What does our human behavior really depend on? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is morality even?
Mm-hmm.
With that said, overall, did you like the book? And who would you recommend this book to if you would recommend it?
I like the book for myself. Similarly to you, I wouldn't have picked it up myself if it wasn't for the recommendation from a personal friend of mine. Otherwise, I would have thought it was just hype, and because it's a sci fi novel, I wouldn't have picked it up myself. However, since I did pick it up and I did enjoy the book, I would recommend it to anyone who does enjoy sci fi and dystopian novels. There isn't a particular person that comes to mind, but anyone who also enjoys science in general or robotics in general might find interest in this.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, I think the sci fi part is a part of this story, but it doesn't seem to be the driver for me.
Mm,
I think the mystery, the connection piece seem to be a bigger theme.
for sure.
I also think a thing that might make this book more interesting is being able to read it through. So I would say for anyone that's going on a trip where they want a quick read to finish,
Mm,
this is a short enough book. The language is simple and easy to get through. So you can just fly by the pages. And reading this as a whole, I think, is going to make the content much more thrilling in the fact that you're not having as many pauses.
for sure, that's fair. I see where you're coming from in that by having these long pauses for us anyway, it made it so that the tension wasn't held for long.
Yeah, and especially between the first and second reads where the story was still building and the world was being created,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't necessarily need that pause. I think where Momo figured out about her mother's information on the laptop and everything, I think that left a good cutoff point, like a good mysterious ending to it.
For sure.
But yeah, if you read it all in one go, I think it would be a lot more fun.
Definitely. Would you recommend the book?
Yeah, I think as a mysterious, I don't know what I'm getting into kind of book, it
Mm-hmm.
would be really, really cool to go through. And also realizing that this was, once again,
'95.
it was written in 1995. So this was when, like, I don't know if M. Night Shyamalan was even there. Like, this was before we really got twists and, like, ooh, like, I didn't realize that this was going to happen kind of thing. So I don't know. It seemed like this book was pretty ahead of its time for what it was writing.
Definitely.
So that is gonna be our last read of The Membranes by Chitawe. We once again want to thank the listener that recommended this book to us.
Yes.
Like Jamae said, I don't know if we would have touched this book otherwise. There are just so many books out there, and translated books sometimes are hard to come by anyway.
Mhm.
So I'm very glad that we had the opportunity to be able to read this book. But with a book that ends, starts another opportunity. And that's going to be us getting into our next book. So before we tell you what that book's going to be, let's go into our hints of jam.
All right. Hint number one, our next book is a poetry collection. Hint number two, the book traces the fragmentation of memory, archive, and family in the face of displacement. And hint number three, This book is written by a well-known author of 2 poetry collections as well as 2 fiction pieces.
Yep. And the book that we're going to be reading is...
The Moon That Turns You Back by Hala Alyan.
Yeah, and so for us to find out a little bit more about this book, let's go ahead and look at the back cover. So the back cover reads, "The contradictions of diasporic love are embodied with this inquisitive poetry collection. A multiplicity of voices, bodies, houses, and cities intersect and create new histories. In poems that range from dreamlike to experimental, interactive to confessional, the moon that turns you back blurs boundaries and borders between place, time, and poetic form. The everyday tedium of infertility lives alongside geopolitical displacement. The nostalgia for return exists within the larger frame of womanhood. At the heart of this collection lies the single, persistent question: what does it mean to transform into something unrecognizable? And what are the things that can bring us back?"
And a little bit about the author. Hala Alyan is the author of the novel Salt Houses, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Arab American Book Award, and a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize. Her latest novel, The Arsonist City, was a finalist for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. She is also the author of 5 highly acclaimed collections of poetry, including The 29th Year. She lives in Brooklyn with her family, where she works as a clinical psychologist and professor at New York University.
Yep, and we're going to be splitting up this book into 2 reads. So we're pretty much trying to split up the poems in half, which means that our first read is going to be
pages 2 through 49, which is Interactive Fiction, House Saints, to Fatima, Comment Out.
Yeah, and we hope you read this book along with us. If you have any suggestions of books that you really liked, just like The Membrane, we'd love to hear from you to find out what that is. We have been really lucky with the recommendations that we have received so far and have very much enjoyed what y'all have been sending us. So please continue to send us your recommendations, and you can do that by
emailing us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com or leaving us a message on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, where we have books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat! Bye!